Hello and welcome everybody to the 12th episode of the Void Wave podcast. And today we're hopefully finishing off our little review and discussion of the ultimate antinatalism argument guide. And yeah, the two sections that are left to discuss are the thought experiments section and the common counterarguments section. The latter of which is pretty long, so we each just picked a couple of the counterarguments we thought were decent, at least, where people can maybe put up a little bit of a fight.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah,
and there was quite a bit of repetition on the common counter arguments because I guess it's looking for people to find exactly what somebody else has said. So we just picked a few which we thought were more relevant and which hadn't been mentioned. But let's start with the thought experiments. So here are a few kind of ideas and kind of potential scenarios that antinatalists, when discussing with somebody they want to persuade, they can use these thought experiments to kind of demonstrate how antinatalism works. And it starts with one about heritable diseases and presupposes this scenario where both kind of a couple have a baby who has Down syndrome, and the couple is quite over 40, and the odds of having another baby with Down syndrome are relatively high. And then it asks the question: should the couple have another baby, right?
Right. And yeah, I mean, I think this is a fine thought experiment. It doesn't have to be like Down syndrome as a heritable disease. It could be any kind of heritable disease which might cause problems to the child, really. And yeah, I think in one way it's good to address the non-identity problem, which is something I think we touched on very, very briefly when discussing the argument section. And the non-identity problem is a problem in philosophy which basically is concerned with the issue of how to evaluate future people, right? Like people who will presumably exist but don't yet exist, and how you should take that into account when making a moral decision. And this is clearly what this thought experiment is about, right?
Yeah, although I think using this argument, with other people, you might be accused of being ableist. So I'm not completely sure about it. I mean, you could easily kind of twist this around to something. Instead of Down syndrome or another heritable disease, you might just kind of put it, use like the perils of life,
Yeah, I think you could make it just more general. Like, don't even bring up heritable diseases. Just make a point that there's a non-zero chance that one of your future offspring will have something horrible happen to them in their life.
Yeah,
and that's basically the risk you have to evaluate. It doesn't have to be a heritable disease.
Yeah, or for example, something like depression, right, which can also be heritable. Yeah. But there's no such stigma as, if you use this argument, is straight away saying that somebody with Down syndrome is not as worthy as a healthy baby of being born, right?
That's true.
Yeah. So,
and also,
but if you say depression, it's okay, I think, because people are still very receptive to it.
Yeah, you could make the argument that would also be an ableist argument.
That's true.
A neurotypical argument that you don't want to give birth to people who might get a mental illness. So yeah, I'm definitely a little bit skeptical in the way it is phrased here, but like just in terms of how it's constructed logically, I think it's a fine thought experiment.
Yeah.
Just considering the risk that something bad might happen to a future offspring and taking that into account.
Yeah. Although it runs into the problem if, of course, the person you're talking to, if they are very healthy or think they're very healthy, and there's like no, everybody in their family has died of old age and not any kind of typical diseases that most people have, etc., etc. So it's very specific, I think, to use, but it does handle very well the non-identity problem. The next one is one of my favorites, and I've used it before. It basically says, imagine if there was no life on Mars. If there was life on Mars, and they would all, imagine, humans lived on Mars or some kind of humanoid creature. They would all be very happy and joyous throughout their lives. But of course, there's no life on Mars, and none of us none of us kind of feel bad about there not existing any life on Mars or any happiness of life on Mars. So why should we feel bad that these children who are not being born don't get to have the pleasures of life?
Yeah, this one is also like somewhat related to the non-identity problem, because obviously if there never existed life on Mars, and there's currently no life on Mars, there isn't anybody around who would miss out on anything, right? This is kind of a very similar argument that David Benatar makes in his book, Better Never to Have Been. And I think it's also a good thought experiment to just demonstrate this kind of this line of thought. But I could see somebody actually saying that yes, they are very sad about the fact that there's no life on Mars and there's no Joey around.
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure there are people who feel that way and who are like super ecstatic about like Elon Musk and his fucking SpaceX expedition trying to bring life to Mars, right? Like, these people do exist.
Yeah, that's true.
Much to my dismay.
Yeah, I mean, a common other argument about this is that, you know, if birth is a joyful thing and that, you know, we should, all the babies that come into existence are a net positive because they're going to experience more pleasure than pain in their lives, then it puts like an enormous pressure on people who say this to be basically constantly breeding, because that's the only ethical thing they can do. I mean, any chance they have to reproduce that they don't use, it's pretty much like preventing an entire lifetime of pleasure, right, for somebody else.
Yeah. And it would be a pretty insane conclusion to make. I think that people just would be obligated to breed as much as they can, because otherwise these not yet existent hypothetical people were missing out on something. Right? Yeah,
I mean, it's a kind of the flip side of this argument. You know, instead of making an argument with total lack of life, you make an argument with as much life as possible, which is, and they're kind of completely untenable, this second position, right? Nobody would want to exist in a state of permanently breeding. Well, I think for men it would be okay because they don't have to go through it. But
for women it would be hell. Because,
yeah, absolute hell.
Like, imagine just chaining back to back pregnancies until the rest of your not the rest of your life would become.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a very good example of what happens to other mammals with this, right? You know, like dairy cows dairy cows who basically kind of die of almost of old age, or get very sick and very weak by the time they're 7 or 8 years old, when their lifespan is like 20 years old, if they were not like constantly being forcibly inseminated. So, you know,
it just causes a lot of stress to the body, and I don't think this is a position that somebody would honestly take.
Yeah,
or genuinely in good faith take, because it's a really strange conclusion to make. Yes, we should all breed as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, because we need to put,
like, I don't think anybody.
Yeah, to put more pleasure creating machines in existence, so there could be more net pleasure created or something. I mean, that just completely falls apart. So this life on Mars, I think it's a good argument in general, until people start to get into stuff like, oh, but we need to keep human consciousness alive or something like that, or prevent our extinction on planet Earth. But that's a whole different thing. That's not. Yeah, it's exactly, not non-identity anyway. All right, the next one is called harm versus pleasure, and this poses an argument. It kind of asks the question of the person you're debating: if they could suffer the absolute worst of pain for 15 minutes, if they could have the most sublime pleasures of life, not my words, this, for 60 minutes after the 15. And it relies on people having the perception that the worst 15 minutes are not worth the 60 best minutes of your life. So this is an argument that I see being used in negative utilitarianism a lot, by the way, where they pose like an asymmetry between kind of the the worst pain and the best pleasure.
Yeah, with the harm versus pleasure thought experiment, the numbers I think are fairly arbitrary. Like you can adjust them up and down, and then you can see where each individual would stand on this, how much suffering they would accept in exchange for so much joy as they think is fitting. And yeah, I'd say that most people would probably not choose to take this exchange, because I think there is something to it that suffering is generally weighted a bit differently than pleasure, and that it is experienced more intensely maybe than most pleasures are. And then there's also like a physiological cap on how much joy you can experience. Like there's neurotransmitters in your brain that go off, and at some point, like your capability to feel something from that is just exhausted. Like there's no more joy to be had, basically.
Yeah, but the same is not true for pain, though. I mean, of course, there's a limit to how much pain you can suffer, but it's a far bigger percentage of what you're feeling in terms of pain. I mean, it can completely overwhelm you, and whereas the most sublime pleasure still leaves a room for a lot of other stuff. Anyway, I think this is a really difficult argument to make, even though negative utilitarians use it a lot, and I've read a lot of their literature, and it includes a lot of this argument. And my reason for it is that when you describe pain for 15 minutes, you have to talk about pain that finishes and ends at 15 minutes, right? Whereas most of the worst forms of suffering, we imagine, would probably leave you disabled or scarred or traumatized for life. So it will be far more than 15 minutes, right? 15 minutes of being, tortured would leave you with a lot more than 15 minutes of suffering than just the 15 minutes, just the memory of those 15 minutes, right? Even if there's no kind of permanent, disabling of your body or something horrific being done to you, like being burned or whatever, without getting too graphic. Whereas the sublime pleasures of life for the 60 minutes or whatever, the sequels to this episode would not have as much relevance as the sequels of the 15 minutes of suffering, right? There's people with PTSD from 15 minutes of panic and suffering and horror, and that can ruin the rest of their lives. But there's nobody who has like the best sex of their life for 16 minutes or whatever you want to say is the sublime pleasure, and who then can use that to overcome everything that happens in their life. There's no positive PTSD, right? So it's really difficult because you have to have this suffering that's kind of just contained to those 15 minutes, and then it ends and you shake the person's hand and you walk out of the room or something. No, that's not how suffering works. And also I think, and this is, I haven't read the scientific literature on this, by the way. I have read some stuff, but not this specifically. But I'm pretty sure that 15 minutes of suffering are almost as intense, of the worst suffering, as intense in the first minute as they are on the 15th minute. Whereas the most sublime joy, you start to get diminishing returns pretty quickly. Because that's the nature of us animals, that we can never get happy with anything for too long, unfortunately. And I'm pretty sure that, as you said, the kind of continuous orgasm for 60 minutes, after a while, I think your brain would start to look for other stuff to concentrate on. Just the nature of things.
Yeah, it's just the biological limits of how we are wired as organisms. And yeah, unfortunately, the cap on suffering is much, much higher than it is on pleasure. Yeah. I think that's generally true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, and of course, this argument, people will want the specifics, right? So unless you got some really good specifics on this, you're kind of stuck with this argument.
Yeah, and also just to finish this off, and it also really only makes sense if you're taking like this kind of approach of harm versus pleasure, right? Like if that's not how you construct your ethics, like if you're not some kind of utilitarian, maybe then maybe this thought experiment is not as useful to you. And that's fair.
So the next one is called Russian Roulette. And it posits this scenario. Well, we have a revolver that has some of the chambers loaded, and you basically kind of the bullets are kind of conditions, which are kind of disease, poverty, discrimination, and you're shooting this at a child. I mean, the bullets won't harm them for being bullets. They just represent these kind of bad situations or bad conditions for the child to be born in. And it imagines that the child might be born without anything, just blanks, right? On the Russian roulette, gets no actual bullets, but there's the risk of a bullet, right? Yeah. And not firing the revolver, which seems the most ethical action in this circumstance, will be not to procreate. So that's kind of how this thought experiment works.
Yeah, I think this is similar to the first thought experiment we've discussed, which is also about the risk you're exposing your offspring to. And well, I think you could even more generalize this Russian roulette thingy even more. Like, you could basically say that having a child is like playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun pointed at your kid, because death is of course a very certain thing. Like, the kid is gonna die because you have them, and you don't have to.
And I think it's
you don't have to deal with the special bullets and possibilities which could stem from that. But you could just say, hey, this is a fully loaded revolver. Would you like to play Russian roulette? Would you let your kid play Russian roulette with that gun? Yeah.
So, I mean, you can imagine a perfect life would be one that all the chambers are empty except for the last one, right?
True.
You just keep firing it, and there's just blank and blank and blank, which is just kind of luck, if you believe in luck, of course. Just luck, and then there's death at the end for sure. There's a bullet somewhere, in there. Which I think works. I mean, it kind of works, I think.
Yeah, again,
I think this one kind of works.
Again, like this is very good to accompany like any argument that's made from risk. I think this is a nice thought experiment to exemplify what you mean by that when you say making an argument from risk. Because the risk of dying is, of course, 100%. at least as it stands. Like, of course, it may be in the future there's some kind of cure for death, but that's not something I would bank on. Personally.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's a cure, there's a way to revive dead people, there can never be immortality, just because there's accidents and war and people who might want to kill you. So even if you cure all diseases, including natural death, if you want to call it that, there's a way to kind of permanently maintain your body without decay. There's always like accidents or mishaps, or people get bored and want to kill themselves. So it's. Death is always there, and unless you have a crystal ball and can see the future, or some kind of algorithm developed in Silicon Valley that predicts when reviving dead bodies is going to happen, then death is assured. And even then, of course, whoever the person who dies might not be able to afford the healthcare to revive them. Right,
that's true.
Or not born of the right class, or in the right place, or being deemed worthy to be revived. Who knows? I don't want to get too sci-fi on this one.
Yeah, I was about to say we were going a little off the cuff here, but I mean, like, whatever bullet is in the revolver, it's gonna hit eventually if you keep playing the game. And the game, in this analogy or this thought experiment, is life, of course.
Yeah, the only winning move is not to play.
True.
Which is from the old movie War Games. Sorry. Okay, the next one is a bit contentious, and there's a reason they actually highlighted this with a link to Wikipedia, because it's talking about the mere addiction paradox, which is talking about having a population who's happy with a certain amount of resources, and the more this population grows, the more the resources have to be spread out. So the less happy the population will be, because they have less resources. And if you just repeat this over and over, the population will grow to a point where, instead of having a small number of people who are happy and content with their resources, now you have a massive population with very little resources for every person, every individual in this population. So that's an argument for antinatalism, I guess. But I'm not a fan of this one.
Yeah, I
all.
think this one is maybe not supposed to be about or not supposed to be used in the way it is used here. I think this is more about just the fact that you're gonna run into, if you keep repeating this process of adding people to the population and then equalizing the resources, you're gonna end up with a society in which the resources are equalized and they are less happy than the population you started with, which has less people and more resources available, but nonetheless, that population you end up with would be preferable to the population you started out with, even though they are less happy on average, and that is what they call here the repugnant conclusion. And yeah, I mean, it also rests on like the assumption that resources will be spread evenly in this population, which doesn't translate well at all to any real life scenario where this is not the case.
Yeah, and it also assumes, I mean, it assumes very linear curves of things happening, right? Because the more population you have, the more resources you'll have. You just have to presuppose that this resource gathering has a limit, which we're now finding out with global warming and other kind of natural human-caused accidents to nature. That let's imagine, for example, if you have a tribe of a population of 20 people living in an enormous small country, right? The amount of resources these 20 people have access to is let's say much smaller than the resources that 20,000 people would have access to, right? Because they're able to extract them, so a population, if anything, with technology as it is, and certainly after the Industrial Revolution, the more population you have, the more resources you have, the availability of resources grows faster than the population, usually, right? And then of course there's a problem of distribution, which we don't have. We have the problem that the things are not distributed equally, so you cannot even get to this argument. And then there's a relationship with resources and happiness, and every single study done on the subject says that as soon as you reach a certain point of security in your life with the resources you have, then adding more resources doesn't add happiness, right? It just kind of billionaires are not happier than millionaires. And millionaires are not necessarily happier than, say, like a first world family with a net income of, I think it was $70,000 or something like that per year, which is quite modest, I think. Quite modest for first world. Yeah,
like this linear relationship between distribution of resources and happiness, I think is like it's contrived. Like it's not how it works in reality. Like, yes, there is a certain amount of resources that everybody requires in order to be free of existential dread and, worrying about, where you're going to spend the night and stuff. Obviously, if you have those securities, that's going to be a major boon to your happiness. But at a certain point, like, it just caps off, and then, more resources doesn't equal more happiness.
Money can buy happiness, right? But I mean, up to a certain point,
it does probably, but then
yeah, it does. But then after that, it's kind of it's up to each person's neuroses and make it feel better than your neighbor or whatever, which is kind of completely outside of anything we should be discussing on this argument. True. So thumbs down for this one.
Yeah, it's a bit,
especially because it requires you to explain like this whole. The paradox and the conclusion, and by the time you finish with this, the person you're talking to probably in their head has moved on to something else. Okay, so there's only 2 thought experiments left. So the next one is called the risky button. It says, would it be okay for me to push a button that might make someone else's life significantly better or significantly worse without their consent, even if there was a 95% chance of a good result and a 5% for a bad result? It would still be unethical because you're gambling with the well-being of another person without consent. I've heard this articulated in a different way, which is, imagine if you knew like in a horse race, that this horse was going to win for sure, and you wanted to do like a surprise to your friend, so you stole their passwords, took all their money from their bank account, and bet it all on this horse, right? And imagine the horse wins. Would your friend be happy with you doing something like that? Imagine if the horse doesn't win. Would your friend be happy with you doing that? Or is it irrelevant if it's ethical or not to do this, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's just another example without imagining a button that will never exist.
Yeah. So this thought experiment touches on like two things. Like one is obviously the question of consent. Like should you be able to make a decision like that regardless of outcome without the person's consent, or the person who's being affected, which is not you. And then the other thing is like ties nicely back to like it's very similar to the Russian roulette thought experiment again, I think, and the heritable disease thought experiment, because it's again about risk, right? And yeah, the argument basically is that even if the odds are good that pushing the button would improve that person's life, you're still exposing the person to a non-zero risk that you gambling with their well-being would turn out badly, which is the argument against pushing the button, I guess. And I'd agree with that. Like you shouldn't make the decision without having consent from the person.
Yeah, even though we do this every day for existing beings, right? But existing beings are non-existing beings, so they're by nature exposed to risk, right? Whenever we do something nice for other people, we're kind of, in a way, presuming their consent on a lot of these actions, right?
That's true.
But those are existing beings, right? They're not non-existing beings who don't even have to be exposed to this conundrum.
Yeah,
right?
And like I think there's an argument to be made that coming into existence in the first place is like it's qualitatively very different from other niceties you could do to a person without their consent, right? Like if I'm assuming this person is walking this direction, I'm going ahead of them and open the door for them, right? Like there's a non-zero chance that they would not be happy with me doing that, maybe because it's humiliating for them or something like that. But that is not something that has like as drastic of an impact on them as them coming into existence and then later on turning out that they'd rather not have come into existence, because that's hard to reverse.
Yeah, and one argument which I don't hear antinatalists use a lot is that there's something cowardly about procreating, which is you brought this person into existence, you kind of feed them, clothe them, protect them for however many years, right? But even if you're like totally obsessed with your baby and teenager and a young adult and then adult, and try to protect them and give them money and do everything for them, the fact is you're very likely to die before they are, right? So there's always like a period of years when you can't do anything for them, right? And even if you feel like, oh no, I have this baby, but I'll protect them from the badness of the world. The truth is, just by the nature of human lifespans, there's a significant amount of this person's life where you won't be able to do anything for them because you've grown old, so you've kind of lost agency over this other person's life, or agency over the world. You can't protect them, basically, right? And there's nothing you can do about it, really, except if your child dies before you, which is probably even worse thing to happen. So, I think that's a useful thought experiment as well. All right. So the last thought experiments, the rape comparison, which unfortunately there's a lot of thought experiments with rape in the antinatalism
that's
canon.
That's true. There's a strange fixation on sexual assault in thought experiments, which I'm not sure is a good thing. But yeah.
Would it be ethical to rape someone if they're in a coma and can't consent? If not, why is it ethical to give birth to someone if they can't consent either? In both cases, you could argue there's a chance they might enjoy it, since sex is generally considered enjoyable, but that does not make it ethical because consent was never established. And I'll just start off by saying, if you're in a coma, sex is definitely not enjoyable to you.
Yeah, that's kind of goes against the definition of what a coma is, right? Like, can't enjoy yourself if you're not conscious.
Yeah, so on that basis, please don't use this thought experiment.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, and I understand what they're trying to go for with this thought experiment. And yes, it's not obviously not quite the same situation as the case with procreation, because yes, you're dealing with a person who's unconscious and can't give consent, but that's not the same thing as a person who doesn't exist yet, right? Like there's a difference there. And the comparison still somewhat works, but it's a bit flawed. So I'd also be careful using this kind of argumentation. But I think it's okay to say that if you're in a situation in which one of your actions involving another party that cannot consent to what you're about to do, and one of the possible consequences of that action is a serious harm, such as like a sexual assault or death, that you shouldn't assume consent in such a situation where one of the outcomes could be seriously harmful.
Yeah, and there's a kind of an interesting area of discussion around consent, where we could be focusing on, which is about, for example, say people who want to kill themselves, right? You see somebody on a bridge, they're going to jump off. Should people intervene in that situation, right? Because if this person clearly sees their life as a harm and a continuous suffering, and something which in their head, as an autonomous human being with agency over their own life and control of our own bodies is something that our society gives a lot of power to in a lot of areas. If this person wants to kill themselves, who are we to stop them, right? And I think this is kind of a much more interesting discussion, and it has nothing to do with sexual assault and comas. But then again, the problem is kind of separating this between this existing person who has looked at their own life and made a choice, and the non-existing being who doesn't have a life, doesn't have no conditions, nothing, not even thoughts or perception of life. Yeah. So I think this line of thought experiments is always very, very fuzzy to get into. And if the person you're trying to persuade has thought a lot about this stuff, you're gonna get caught in like a quagmire of arguments that you can't get out of.
Yeah, it just goes back essentially to the non-identity problem again, where you when you're trying to make a moral decision about a person who doesn't exist yet, you kind of have to assume what the interests of this person would be if they were already in existence, right? Which is difficult to do. So yeah, these kind of arguments are always a bit difficult to have.
Yeah, I mean, let's just think that every antinatalist living right now, well, most of them, okay, are the children of people who wanted to have babies.
Right. Yeah.
So, and obviously, when the parents had that antinatalist baby, they were not thinking, oh, clearly this person is going to think that life is not worth it.
Yeah. That would be exceptionally cruel to bring somebody in existence fully well knowing that the person probably would not like to come into existence, right? Like that would be sadism, which I don't think most people who have kids are sadists.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of throughout this history, a lot of babies have been born for purely instrumental functions, right? Yeah. We have a farm. I'm getting old. We need more farm hands. Have kids. Some of them will stay in the farm and help us, and they'll take care of us when we get old and cannot plow the fields or whatever.
Yeah, a lot of these births were also probably just accidental. Like people, for the longest time didn't exactly know how babies were made. Just had sex because it feels good, and then whoops, there's the baby, right? And they didn't really consider it like an ethical question at all. And I think that's somewhat true still today. That like a lot of people don't even consider the ethical implications of what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump to the common counterarguments, which now runs to 51.
Yes, it's a lot.
and but when we started this guide, it was only 47, and that already was like pretty bloated, and now it's 51, which means that the creators of this guide are doing a lot of arguing if they found 51 common ones. Yeah,
like as we mentioned earlier, there's some repetition there, and some of the counter arguments are basically the same objections but stated in a slightly different way or looked at from a slightly different angle. Yeah, so we decided to pick pick a few we thought there's a discussion there to be had.
The first one we picked was number 15, which is the common counterargument, which is it's impossible to receive consent from a non-existing person, I guess. And it says if you can't get consent, the default answer is always no, such as how it is immoral to rape an unconscious or drunk person. Once again, more rape.
There we go again.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think it's a common counter-argument to antinatalism, and a common reply. This doesn't go into detail. For example, if you see a person lying on the street, you have no idea if this person tried to kill themselves or not. You'll just assume they haven't, and you'll call an ambulance, right? And you call the ambulance with expectation people will come in and kind of violate this person's body autonomy by resuscitating them or giving them medication or oxygen or performing some kind of hands-on procedure on the person to kind of revive them because they assume that this person wants to be revived, right? This person wants to live. So this is a fuzzy one because of that kind of stuff. When you say if you can't get consent, the default answer is always no.
Yeah, that's
not really, right?
I agree with you here. Like, I don't think the default answer is always no. Like in the sexual assault scenario, obviously the answer is no. But as you said, like when it comes to life-saving measures and stuff like this, when the person is unconscious and cannot actively call out for help or something like this, I think the reasonable default assumption is that they would give consent to life-saving measures if they could. And any scenario where say somebody is in a situation where they cannot communicate their consent or not, for example, people in very abusive relationships who feel afraid to even tell their friends that they're in an abusive relationship, right? And so the friends maybe can sense it and assume that person is in a bad situation and kind of intervene to rescue the person, for example. So it gets very fuzzy very quickly. Yeah, right? Consent is always difficult because there's definitely arguments to be made in some cases on why consent shouldn't be respected. Like in the case of abusive relationship, or maybe with a drug addiction or something like that, I think an intervention could be reasonably made, and obviously legally speaking, which is different from moral argumentation, but this is also the case with minors, right? Like parents don't need the consent of the kids to do stuff to them, which may or may not be a problem, but usually it is accepted that kids should be sent to school against their consent, maybe. Or be vaccinated against their consent if they don't like such needles or whatever, right? But the difficulty... So it's fuzzy. Yeah, it's definitely fuzzy, and I think, again, the difficulty very much in the same way, like with the sexual assault thought experiment, is that it's not quite the same situation as when talking about a person who doesn't exist at all. Like an unconscious person is already in existence. They have interests, even though they might not be able to state them at that point in time. But with a person who doesn't exist yet, this impossibility of attaining consent is very absolute, right? Like you cannot wait until they wake up because, that's the thing in question, right? Bringing them into existence or not. And no matter how long you wait, they will not tell you whether or not they are okay with it because they don't exist yet, right? Which makes procreation, again, a special case. And this ties in with the common counter-argument number 17, which is, why should I care about the consent of someone who doesn't exist, right? And then the guide says, because they will exist once they're born, at that point it's too late to reverse it once they do suffer. The only way to ensure that this won't happen is not to have them at all, which I agree with, and which kind of summarizes very tidily this whole non-existence, non-identity problem. Yeah, I agree with that. Like it's definitely the procreative act is an act which will result in the person you're creating suffering from the consequences of that act later down the line, right? So it's a delayed reaction of consequences, basically.
Yeah, and there's more to it as well, right? Because somebody who doesn't exist cannot obviously consent, but it's also impossible for us to determine kind of all these conditions of the person, and also I've seen this common counter argument to antinatalism, by the way, which is, well, if the person doesn't like their life, they can always end it.
Yeah.
But ending a life is an extremely difficult thing, which should never be talked about as just like returning a gift. Yeah,
you shouldn't.
It's not like be given, like, oh, you're given a present at your birthday party. You look at the shoes; they're fucking ugly, and you say, "Well, I hope this doesn't change our friendship, but I don't like the shoes you gave me. You can have them back. I appreciate the gesture." Suicide is not like that.
You cannot give back life and just walk away, right? And that's actually that's the first counter argument on the list here, I think. The if you don't like it, then why don't you kill yourself thing, which is appropriately the first one on the list, I think, because it's probably the most common flippant counter argument people make. And yeah, it's just a bit silly, because like putting the responsibility like on the person who is unhappy with their existence is like, it's very cruel, because they are not here by their own choosing, obviously, right? And as you already said, like, ending your life isn't as easy as just flipping a switch or something.
Yeah, and ending all the records we have of suicide letters, for example, or people who were very who had an existence that included a lot of self-expression, like writers, poets, musicians who killed themselves, and who before their deaths used their arts to express their anguish at existing, do not paint a very rosy picture of ending your own life.
No, it's not fun.
It's usually the result of a long, tortured process that culminates into suicide, and it's not something that you can handle with this lightness of just saying, well, if they don't like it, they can just kill themselves. Oh yeah, so you made a baby, and you're okay with this person later on just saying, oh, I hate my life, I'm going to kill myself, and you're okay with that? Is that something that leaves you proud of your actions?
It's just weird. Like, just imagine coming from a parent. Like, oh, if my kid doesn't like it, they can just kill themselves, right? It's just like, I don't think that the typical parent would make that kind of argumentation in good faith again, because typically,
usually when people kill themselves, they kill other people as well, right? Emotionally,
it causes a lot of pain for others as well. So that is also arguably very unethical.
Yeah. We even see this in a lot of the studying I've been doing on right to die and euthanasia. Even people who are in kind of very bad circumstances with like degenerative diseases and they're due to die in 3 months from now, and it's basically like 3 months of pain. Even a lot of people in those circumstances, they do everything not to die, right? They will take any treatment, live lives of absolute misery just to prolong the inevitable.
Yeah, it's a scary thought.
And
death is something that people gloss over a bit too quickly, I think, in these types of argumentations, because really sitting down and contemplating that one day your existence is gonna end is like, it's not an easy not an easy pill to swallow, right? Like, maybe I'm kind of biased because I had one experience where this type of thought caused me a minor panic attack, and it wasn't exactly pleasant, obviously. But yeah, I think people should give more credence to arguments which are about death being a serious harm to consider.
But from hanging out in antinatalist spaces and being in a few antinatalist debates myself, I've been told to kill myself a lot of times.
Yeah, so am I. That's,
by parents and future parents.
That's
so there you go.
Unfortunately, how it goes often.
Okay, number 22. Human life is inherently valuable. And so this is the counter-argument, and then the guide says, human life comes with suffering. Since there's no way to know if somebody who is born will find suffering worthwhile, they should not be forced into a world where they will suffer just because you want to continue your bloodline. So this is a common counter-argument. But again, with the things we were talking about, kind of maximizing your life-generating potential, nobody really believes this. They believe that existing life is valuable, but they do not believe that because this existing life is valuable, that you need to add more to it to try to maximize it. Because if they really they believe that, they would try to maximize it.
Yeah,
I agree that existing human life is inherently valuable. Potential human life is not inherently valuable because it's just a potentiality.
Yeah, like it's really only true for life that already exists, and like in that case, I don't even disagree with the statement that it's valuable, because like if you look at how antinatalism is defined, both here in the guide and on the wiki page or whatever, it's defined as assigning negative value to birth, and yes, it's a negative value, but it's a value nonetheless, right? So there is some value that is being assigned to life, even though we think it's generally negative in quality. But antinatalism is not a moral nihilism or something like this, which I think, this would be actually a counter argument against, right? Somebody saying, okay, life has no value whatsoever, and then you could say, oh, but I think life is inherently valuable. You can make an argument for that.
I mean, you could at least say that you consider your own life to be valuable.
Yeah, which
right?
People typically do, right? Like even if they may be not very comfortable stating that out, right? But I think usually people are in some way at least attached to their own existence, right? It's not something we can really help.
I'm attached to my own existence even when I'm not happy with the life I have.
Yeah.
But I still attach a value to it. I mean, that's pretty much, I think, my human brain keeping on,
Yeah, I agree.
Even on the bad times, usually.
It's just something that's like making these value judgments it's not really optional, I think. I think people just have to do it. Like you cannot not assign value to certain things in your life. It's just a natural part of what the human condition is, making value judgment. And part of those value judgments is usually a judgment about your own life. Whether you evaluate it negatively or positively depends, obviously.
Yeah. I think some of this valuable word in this case comes from stuff like, well, what if this person is the next Einstein, or who will carry on kind of humanity's adventure or
like
something.
There's always a notion of progress. Yeah. Like there's a notion of progress being slipped in. And it's often it evolves into argumentations about not the question of procreation as such, but about the continuation of the species, and whether or not people have an ethical obligation to ensure that the species continues, right?
Well, if they do, that's a heavy burden to carry.
That's a very heavy burden. But on the other hand, like there's like how many humans are there? 7 billion plus humans on Earth.
We're getting close to 8 billion,
getting
I think.
Close to 8. So, like don't put that much pressure onto yourself with securing the continued existence of the species, because I mean there's quite a lot of us, and I don't think we're going to go extinct anytime soon, whether it's voluntarily or by accident.
I mean, extinction will happen inevitably.
Of course.
It's just a question of time scale and the conditions of it. I know for sure it won't happen out of willing. It won't happen because humans decide collectively to go extinct themselves.
Yeah, it's very unlikely that's the scenario in which we're going to go, which would be preferable to a violent end to the species, of course, but it's just not very likely that most people will come around to this viewpoint, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, even if you assume that humans achieve some kind of technological transcendence, like that we're like become immortal transhuman beings, like entropy is still gonna go to work, right? And like after trillions of years, like even the fundamental building blocks of what we understand the physical universe to be, they are in decay, right? Like all the protons are gonna decay, and even if we were to achieve like quasi-immortality, like there would still be an end to the species at some point into the far future. So I don't think this is...
I mean, let alone when you start messing with that kind of sci-fi stuff, you can get to a point where you might not even say that it's still the human species, right?
That's a different question. I think at one point, does a human stop being a human and become something else? Yeah.
And then imagine how these spacefaring future humans, how embarrassing they would be of us back on Earth with our 80 years of lifespan and reproducing sex by using sex and body fluids. They'd be so embarrassed of us.
It would be like us looking back on the fish thingy, which went out of the ocean, the first land animal.
Yeah,
it would be kind of.
But sad. It's kind of the same as us saying stuff like, we must keep the legacy of that fish thingy that came out of the ocean. Yeah. We must reproduce to keep the legacy of them. So this kind of sci-fi scenario, they would be looking at us thinking that, right? I mean, they would never be motivated that stuff. But we'll never get there, I don't think.
I mean, none of us will be living to see anything like this anyway. So yeah.
I don't know. I take my vitamins every day. Okay.
Take your B12, people. If you're vegan,
as vegans,
you need your B12.
B12. Number 30. If things were different, there wouldn't be so much resource consumption and suffering. This is the kind of common counter-arguments, and then the guide says, how do you know things will change? If it does not change or even gets worse, your child will suffer the consequences. It's not a risk that your child ever consented to, because they might never get to experience this potential utopia. And then he talks about kind of climate change, excessive resource consumption, pollution, and kind of other issues that make it unethical to reproduce. All these issues which we don't have a solution for them yet. This is a very dangerous road to go down in terms of arguing with somebody in favor of antinatalism, because if you start kind of making these things very real, like stuff like climate change, you might just find somebody who believes climate change will be solved, right? Or says, we've survived worse, which is actually true, by the way.
We probably have survived worse things, but yeah, I think like this is an objection which again, like, it kind of sneaks in this notion of that, there's generally progress and there is a world imaginable which has so much less suffering that maybe coming into existence wouldn't be as much of a harm and stuff like this. And yeah, I think like the objection is definitely the objection from the antinatalist side, I mean, is definitely true, because we cannot know for sure if things really will go better. Because for all we know, tomorrow there might be some kind of unforeseen catastrophe, like wrecking everything we are trying to do in order to deal with issues like climate change and stuff. Because that's why the climate change example, I think, is pretty good, because experts have been off in their predictions about it. Like 20 years ago, they made their predictions, and now we see that their predictions were too conservative and that things are already worse than they'd expected, right? And making these kind of predictions is always hard, obviously, but yeah, I don't think that it's a good argument to make, because then, like, what would you argue for? Like sacrificing your people at the altar of progress or something like that. I don't think that would make it ethical.
Yeah.
Necessarily.
I mean, you could say, humans survived the Ice Age, right? Yes, but would you want to live through the Ice Age?
Like, it's not a good justification of putting somebody through that. And in there, there's also the implication of putting this responsibility onto your offspring. Like, hey, we and all the generations before me, we've caused this issue, and I'm gonna make you to solve it, right? That's a gigantic responsibility you put on somebody, which I don't think is very fair.
I mean, the Black Plague killed a much bigger percentage of the population than Corona has killed or probably will ever kill, and humanity survived through it. But, if you're creating a child just to survive through horrible things, what does that make you?
Yeah, like, it's probably not much of a life to live, right? Assuming that things get even worse, like to a point where, it's not worth living anymore. And at that point, it would obviously also not be worth starting. So even from a conditionally antinatalist point of view, I'd say, like, conditions could definitely deteriorate to a point at which you'd have to conclude that starting a new life isn't worth it anymore. So there's no guarantee that things would go in the other direction, and get so much better that it's not going to be a problem.
Okay, so I think that's all the common counter-arguments we wanted to cover in this episode, or in the podcast at all. There's another section of the guides about that has a link to the activism guide on the subreddit, and also some sterilization resources, mostly like a list of doctors who perform things. I think last time I checked, this was very kind of US focused.
Yeah, I think most of the people working on the guide are probably from the US, or at least North America. So yeah, this could maybe be expanded upon for our Euro bros.
In general, if you're looking for anything related to sterilization, I would say go look into kind of the child-free sector of the internet, because they have many more people than we do, and they will have kind of far more resources and things about that. I mean, it's like there's like if you're looking at Venn diagrams, there's an overlap between child-free lifestyle and antinatalism, but of course their bubble is much bigger than the antinatalist bubble. So, anything that kind of has an overlap, they will have a lot more resources and advice than antinatalists will have in general.
Yeah. Anything to add? I think, like, in conclusion, again, like, the guide could be cleaned up a little bit more. Maybe remove some of the repetitions, maybe some of the redundancy, simplify some of the thought experiments and arguments a little bit. But overall, I think it's a pretty good and comprehensive guide. And yeah, I had fun reviewing it with you.
Yeah, I liked it a lot, because it's a good thing to have when a lot of literature on antinatalism is kind of very academic and philosophical, and not everybody wants to read like a 300-400 page book on this subject, including like 1 million footnotes. And whereas, something like this guide you can read, in a couple of hours. You can kind of go through this and think about it, and it probably does its job in that sense.
Yeah. With that, the project definitely has our support, and again, we hope our criticism was constructive. And yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot for listening. Make sure to follow us or subscribe, depending on the platform you're using to listen to this. And do send us emails with suggestions at voidwavepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much.
Yeah, as always, thank you so much for listening, and talk to you guys next week. Bye-bye.